Once a lonely millionaire spent Christmas alone until his new employee, a single mother, invited him to dinner at her home. He never imagined he would fall in love with her that night, a story that will touch your heart. Subscribe to the channel, leave a like, and comment on where you are watching from. The artificial snow at the shopping mall grotesquely contrasted with the sweltering heat of December in New York. Edward Henry Montgomery gazed out of the bulletproof window of his office on the 47th floor of the Empire State Building, where his company, Montgomery Steel Corporation, occupied the top 5 floors. At 45, he was considered the king of steel in the United States, controlling 60% of the national production and moving figures that made economic ministers lose sleep. His reflection in the window revealed a man standing at 6'1", with perfectly combed grey hair, tailored Italian suits, and a posture that exuded power. But his dark brown eyes, almost black, carried a coldness that could not hide a deep loneliness. His hands, always impeccably groomed, nervously drummed on the solid mahogany table as he reviewed the fourth-quarter financial reports. "Mr. Montgomery," a female voice pulled him from his thoughts. He turned to find his new executive assistant standing at the door. Ms. Smith, 32, had been hired just 3 weeks ago to replace his former assistant, who had resigned after a nervous breakdown. Ms. Smith was different from all the other employees who had come and gone. Her 5'6" frame seemed imposing when she entered the room, not out of arrogance, but from a serene confidence that Edward rarely saw in people of her hierarchical position. Her wavy brown hair was always neatly tied up in an elegant bun, and her green eyes conveyed a sharp intelligence that intrigued him. She wore simple, yet always impeccable business attire, and carried a subtle scent of vanilla that reminded Edward of something he couldn't quite identify. "The reports from the Pittsburgh plant are ready," she said, approaching the table with a folder in hand. "And you have a meeting with the Japanese investors at 4 p.m. Edward nodded, taking the documents. But he noticed that Ms. Smith did not immediately withdraw, as all the other employees did. She remained there with a thoughtful expression that unsettled him. "Is there anything else, Ms. Smith?" he asked, not lifting his eyes from the papers. "Actually, yes." Ms. Smith took a deep breath. "Mr. Montgomery, may I ask you a personal question?" Edward finally looked up, surprised. In 15 years of running that company, no employee had ever asked him a personal question. His expression instinctively hardened. "That depends on the question. Are you going to spend Christmas alone again?" The silence that followed was deafening. Edward felt as if he had been punched in the stomach. How did she know? He always kept his personal life completely separate from work. "That's none of your business," he replied coldly, returning his gaze to the documents. Ms. Smith was undeterred. Instead, she took a step forward and leaned slightly over the table, forcing him to look her in the eyes. "Forgive me, sir, but it is my business. I work with you every day. I see how you are in the days leading up to the holidays. I see the sadness in your eyes when all the employees leave early to be with their families." Edward stood up abruptly, walking to the window. The city stretched out before him like a sea of concrete and lights, but everything felt empty and distant. "Ms. Smith, I suggest you focus on your professional duties and leave my personal life alone." "Why?" The question came with disarming simplicity. "Why do you condemn yourself to this? Christmas should be about togetherness, about family. It doesn't matter if it's a blood family or a family we choose." Edward turned slowly. Miss Smith stood in the middle of the room, arms crossed, and for the first time in years, someone was confronting him not about business, but about his humanity. "You know nothing about my family," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "I know they haven't spoken to you in over 10 years. I know your mother died without you reconciling. And I know you built this steel empire as a fortress to protect yourself from the pain of being alone." Edward was in shock. How the hell did she know all this? Her investigation into his past had been much deeper than he had imagined. How? I research the people I work with, Mr. Montgomery, not out of morbid curiosity, but because I believe that to be a good assistant, I need to understand my boss as a person, not just as a businessman. Anger began to boil within him. So you think you're a psychologist now? No. Miss Smith shook her head. I see myself as a mother who knows how to recognize when someone is suffering. The word mother hit Edward like a lightning bolt. He had completely forgotten that Miss Smith had a daughter. In 3 weeks of work, she had never mentioned the child during office hours. Your daughter, he murmured. Lily. She's 8 years old. She's the light of my life. Miss Smith's face lit up as she spoke about the girl. And do you know what she asked me yesterday when I told her my boss was going to spend Christmas alone? Edward did not respond, but his expression showed curiosity. She asked why I didn't invite you to dinner with us. She said, no one should be alone on Christmas. Edward felt his throat go dry. An 8-year-old child who didn't even know him had shown more compassion for him than his own family had in over a decade. And so, Ms. Smith continued with a shy smile, I'm here making the official invitation. You shouldn't spend Christmas alone. Why not have dinner at our home? Edward's world seemed to stop. His rational mind screamed to refuse, to maintain professional barriers, to avoid exposing himself to vulnerability. But something inside his chest, something he thought had died long ago, whispered a word he hadn't heard in years. Yes. I don't know, he stammered, completely disarmed by the proposal. You don't have to decide now, said Marina, heading for the door. But the offer stands. Lily is making French toast for the first time, and I promised I would make my grandmother's turkey. Dinner is at 7 p.m. on Christmas Eve. She paused at the door and turned one last time. Mr. Montgomery, everyone deserves a family, even if it's borrowed for a night. And with that, Marina left, leaving Edward alone with his thoughts and a strange feeling in his chest, something that took him a few minutes to recognize as hope. 2 days passed since Marina's invitation, and Edward couldn't shake that conversation from his mind. Sitting in his penthouse in the Upper East Side, a 5,000-square-foot apartment decorated by a renowned Italian designer, he gazed at the crystal dining table that seated 12, but had served only him for years. The silence was broken only by the hum of the air conditioning and the distant noise of New York traffic. His morning routine was always the same. Wake up at 5:30 a.m., work out in the building's private gym, take a cold shower, and review financial reports while sipping his imported espresso. But on that Tuesday morning, December 22nd, something felt different. Edward found himself thinking about Marina's expression when she spoke about her daughter, the light that filled her green eyes when she mentioned the French toast and the turkey. The intercom buzzed, interrupting his thoughts. Mr. Edward, your assistant is here, announced the doorman. Edward frowned. Marina had never come to his home, and it was only 7 a.m. Send her up. Minutes later, Marina emerged from the private elevator carrying a thermal bag and a determined expression on her face. She wore a simple navy blue dress and flat shoes, but Edward noticed her hair was loose, cascading over her shoulders in natural waves. Good morning, Mr. Montgomery. Sorry to bother you so early. Ms. Smith, what are you doing here? Did something happen at the company? Marina shook her head and lifted the thermal bag. I brought breakfast. Fresh brioche from the bakery in my neighborhood, homemade berry jam that my neighbor made, and freshly brewed coffee. Edward stood in the entryway, completely taken aback. Why? Because I bet you only drink that bitter coffee from the Italian machine and eat bland toast every day. Marina walked past him and entered the living room, placing the bag on the coffee table. And because we need to talk. Talk about what? Edward followed her, watching as she unpacked the items with the ease of someone who was at home. About the fact that you are clearly interested in my invitation, but afraid to accept. Marina turned to face him. Lily stayed up late last night asking if Mommy's boss was going to have dinner with us. Edward felt a tightness in his chest. She asked about me? She did, and has already decided she likes you. Marina smiled. She said anyone who lets Mommy work in such a beautiful office and has a secretary as nice as Ms. Johnson must be a good person. Edward couldn't help but smile. Ms. Johnson had been the receptionist on the executive floor for 15 years, a 58-year-old black woman who treated all the employees as if they were her children. She had always been especially affectionate with the children who occasionally visited the office. Does Lily know Ms. Johnson? She does. The day I came to sign the contract, I had no one to leave Lily with, so I brought her along. Miss Johnson spent 2 hours showing her the drawings she keeps in her drawer, drawings made by her grandchildren, and telling funny stories about the office. Edward fell silent. He had no idea Ms. Johnson kept drawings in her drawer, let alone that she told stories about the office. Marina continued pulling things from the bag, a stainless steel thermos, fresh bread rolls wrapped in parchment paper, a jar of homemade jam with a handwritten label, and a small jar of butter. "Have a seat," she said, gesturing to one of the Italian armchairs. "Let's have coffee like civilized people." Edward complied, mesmerized by Marina's ease in his personal space. She poured the coffee into 2 cups she had brought in the bag. Simple white porcelain cups that contrasted sharply with Edward's fine English china. The first sip was a revelation. The coffee was rich, aromatic, with a flavor that immediately transported him back to his childhood when his grandmother brewed coffee on the farm in Napa Valley. "My God," he murmured. "What coffee is this?" "It's from Mr. John, from the roastery in my neighborhood. He roasts the beans every morning and grinds them fresh, no imported capsules or $15,000 machines." Marina bit into a piece of bread with jam. Sometimes the best things in life are the simplest. Edward tasted the bread and involuntarily closed his eyes. The texture was perfect, soft inside and crispy outside, and the jam had a sweet tart flavor that exploded on his palate. "Marina," he said, using her name for the first time. "Can I ask you a question?" "Of course." "Why are you doing this? Why do you care if I spend Christmas alone or not?" Marina paused, with the cup halfway to her mouth. Her green eyes locked onto his with an intensity that made him uncomfortable. "Because I recognize loneliness when I see it," she replied simply. "I was married for 8 years, to a man who left me alone even when he was home. I know what it's like to live surrounded by beautiful, expensive things, but with no one to share them with." Edward felt a chill in her stomach. "Your husband, ex-husband, he died in a car accident 2 years ago." Mary's voice lowered. "He was coming back from his mistress's house when he lost control of the car on a curve on the highway." The silence that followed was heavy. Edward didn't know what to say. All his experience with condolences came from the corporate world, where words were calculated and formal. "I'm sorry," he finally said. "Me too. Not for his death, to be honest. But for Lily losing her father, no matter how imperfect he was." Mary discreetly wiped her eyes. "She spent 2 years asking me when Daddy was coming home. It was the hardest thing I've ever had to explain." Edward leaned forward. "And now, how is she?" "Better. Much better. We have our routine, our rituals. We make pizza on Fridays, watch movies on Saturdays, go to the park on Sundays." Mary smiled. "We've created our own family, just the 2 of us." "And why do you want to include a stranger in this family?" Mary studied him for a long moment before answering. "Because you're not a stranger. I've been working with you for 3 weeks, but I've already learned a lot about who you really are. I see how you treat the staff when you think no one is watching, how you always ask about the health of the cleaner's daughter who was sick, how you doubled the value of the Christmas basket for all the contractors without making a fuss." Edward was surprised. He hadn't imagined anyone had noticed those small gestures. "I also see," Mary continued, "how you pull away from people before they can pull away from you, how you build walls to protect a heart that just wants to be loved." Mary's words hit Edward like a punch. He abruptly stood up and walked to the window, trying to regain control. "You don't know me," he said, his back to her. "Maybe not, but I know enough to see that you deserve more than this empty life you've built." Mary stood up too. "Edward? Can I call you Edward?" He nodded without turning around. "Edward, I'm not trying to save you. I'm not your therapist or your savior. I'm just offering company for a Christmas dinner. Nothing more, nothing less." Edward finally turned to face her. "And if I accept and don't know how to behave? It's been so long since I've had a normal conversation with a child." Mary laughed, a melodious sound that echoed through the room. "Lily will take care of everything. She has an opinion on everything from cartoons to climate change. You just need to show up and be yourself. And what if I'm not good enough? Then we'll figure it out together." Edward watched her for a long moment. Mary stood there, her loose hair shining in the morning light, offering him something he hadn't received in years: unconditional acceptance. "What time did you say dinner was?" The smile that lit up Mary's face was like the sunrise. 7 o'clock, Maple Street, 247, yellow house with a green gate. Lily has already chosen your spot at the table." Christmas Eve arrived, wrapped in a light rain that turned the streets of New York into mirrors reflecting the Christmas lights. Edward had been standing in front of his closet mirror for 15 minutes, unable to decide what to wear. His collection of Italian suits seemed inappropriate for a dinner in a simple house in Brooklyn. Finally, he opted for navy dress pants, a white linen shirt, and a casual blazer, the closest to casual his wardrobe allowed. In the passenger seat of his black Mercedes-Benz S-Class, there was a bag with gifts he had bought during a panic-filled afternoon at the Mall of America. For Lily, he chose a set of illustrated books about astronomy, something educational, but he hoped would be interesting for an 8-year-old. For Mary, he had debated for hours between expensive jewelry and something more personal, finally opting for a first edition of The Little Prince he found in a luxury second-hand store on Augusta Street. As he drove through the wet streets, Edward felt his stomach twist. He couldn't remember the last time he felt so nervous. Not even in meetings with Japanese investors or negotiations with the federal government had he experienced this anxiety that now consumed him. Maple Street was a typical middle-class residential street in Brooklyn. 2-story townhouses, some with small gardens, others with converted garages. House 247 stood out exactly as Mary had described, a yellow house with a green gate and a small hose in the front yard. Christmas lights twinkled in the window, and Edward could hear Christmas music coming from inside. He parked on the street and stood still for a few minutes, watching the house. It was so different from everything he knew. There was no doorman, visible security system, or cameras, just a simple house where a family was preparing to celebrate Christmas. Taking a deep breath, Edward grabbed the bag of gifts and walked to the gate. Before he could ring the bell, the front door opened and a small girl came running through the garden. "Mommy, Mommy, he's here!" shouted Lily, stopping in front of the gate with a huge smile on her face. Edward was momentarily speechless. Mary's daughter was a miniature version of her mother. Loose brown curly hair, bright green eyes, and contagious energy. She wore a red dress with small Christmas decorations and knee-high striped socks. "Hi," said Lily, opening the gate without ceremony. "You're Edward. Mommy said you're very important and have a huge company." "Hi, Lily," Edward managed to say, surprised by the girl's naturalness. "It's a pleasure to meet you." "Did you bring presents?" she asked, looking at the bag with childlike curiosity. "Lily!" Mary appeared at the door, wiping her hands. Mary wore an apron with a reindeer print. "Let Edward in before interrogating him." Edward smiled, feeling immediately more relaxed. Mary was radiant, her hair pulled back in a loose ponytail, wearing a simple emerald green dress that accentuated her eyes. She seemed completely at ease in her element, very different from the composed executive he knew from the office. "Sorry for the rush," said Mary, giving him a kiss on the cheek that caught him off guard. The scent of vanilla was more intense, mixed with aromas of cinnamon and cloves coming from the kitchen. "Come in, please. You can leave your coat on the rack over there." The house was small but cozy. The living room had a floral-patterned two-seater sofa, a worn brown leather armchair that clearly was someone's favorite spot, and a modest-sized television resting on a wooden stand. The walls were adorned with photos of Mary and Lily at various moments: trips, birthdays, Mother's Day. A 5-foot Christmas tree occupied the corner of the room, decorated with handmade ornaments and colorful lights. "What a lovely home," Edward said sincerely, observing the details that showed a life lived with love and simplicity. "It's small, but it's ours," Mary replied proudly. "Lily, would you like to show your drawings to Edward while I finish the turkey?" "Of course." Lily took Edward's hand without hesitation, pulling him to the sofa. "Look, I drew this picture of Mommy working in your office, and this is you." Edward looked at the drawing and felt a lump in his throat. Lily had drawn a tall man in a suit behind a huge desk, but what moved him was that she had given the character a giant smile that represented him. "You drew me smiling," he noted. "Of course, Mommy said you don't smile much at work, but that deep down, you're a good person. So I drew how you will look after dinner tonight." Mary paused at the kitchen door, watching the interaction with a smile. Edward didn't notice, but she saw him relax his shoulders for the first time since he arrived. "Edward," said Mary, "would you like to see the kitchen? I could use some help with the potatoes." The kitchen was the heart of the home, small but organized, with pots of different sizes on the stove, well-kept utensils, and the intoxicating aroma of a Christmas feast being prepared with love. The turkey was in the oven, golden and fragrant, while a large pot boiled with potatoes and another sautéed stuffing. "Do you really need help, or do you just want to get me out of Lily's interrogation?" Edward asked with a smile. "Both," Mary admitted, laughing. "Lily can be a bit intense when she's curious about someone, and honestly, I could use help peeling these potatoes." Edward took off his blazer and rolled up the sleeves of his shirt. "I'm not exactly a kitchen expert, but I can try." Mary handed him a peeler, and they stood side by side at the small sink, working in comfortable silence. Edward was surprised at how relaxing the simple activity was. In his penthouse, all meals were prepared by a professional chef or delivered by expensive restaurants. "Thank you for coming," Mary said softly. "I know it must have been hard to accept." "Thank you for insisting," Edward replied. "It's been a while since I felt—" "What?" "Normal. Like just an ordinary person having dinner with friends." Mary paused what she was doing and looked at him. "You are an ordinary person, Edward. You may have an extraordinary bank account, but at the end of the day, you're just a man who deserves company and affection like anyone else." Before Edward could respond, Lily appeared in the kitchen carrying a small box wrapped in colorful gift paper. "Edward, I made a present for you." "Lily," Mary warned, "remember what we talked about regarding not bothering the guests." "But I'm not bothering. I'm giving a present," the girl insisted. Edward knelt down to be at Lily's height. "Can I open it now?" "Yes!" Inside the little box was a handmade keychain made with colorful beads and a small metal tag where Lily had carefully engraved, "Best Mommy's Boss." Edward was speechless. In all his adult life, no one had made something handmade specifically for him. All the gifts he received were expensive items chosen by personal assistants or corporate gifts from suppliers. "Lily," he said with a choked voice, "this is the most beautiful gift I've ever received." "Really?" The girl's eyes sparkled. "Really? I'm going to put it on my car keys right now." Lily clapped her hands in joy and ran to the living room, probably to tell someone about her achievement. Mary watched the scene with tears in her eyes. "She spent the whole afternoon making this. She said she wanted you to know how lucky we are to have you letting Mommy work with you." Edward looked at the keychain in his hands. a simple and imperfect object that meant more to him than any rare jewel in his collection. "Mary," he said, carefully putting the keychain in his pocket, "can I ask you a personal question?" "Of course. How do you do it? How do you manage to raise such a special person as a single mother, working all day, handling all the responsibilities alone?" Mary smiled, but Edward noticed a shadow of sadness passing through her eyes. "It's not always easy. There are nights when I go to bed exhausted, wondering if I'm doing everything wrong, if Lily is missing out by not having a present father, if I'm enough for her. I can assure you that you are more than enough. Thank you. That means a lot coming from you." The oven timer beeped, indicating that the turkey was ready. Mary opened the oven, and the aroma that filled the kitchen made Edward involuntarily close his eyes. It was the smell of his childhood, of Christmas dinners at the family farm, before everything got complicated. "It's ready," Mary announced. "The feast is served." The dining room table had been transformed into an altar of simplicity and abundance. Mary had used a white tablecloth with delicate embroidery that had belonged to her grandmother, simple yet well-kept white porcelain plates, and cutlery that, although not silver, shone impeccably clean. In the center of the table, a floral arrangement from the yard, red roses and greenery, shared space with aromatic candles that exuded the scent of vanilla. Edward paused at the entrance of the room, observing the table set for 3. It was so different from the solitary dinners at his crystal table for 12, where he ate sophisticated dishes prepared by renowned chefs while gazing at the city through the bulletproof windows. "Sit here, Edward." Lily pointed to a chair beside hers. "Mommy always sits at the head of the table because she is the head of the house, and I chose you to sit next to me because you are Mommy's boss." Edward laughed at the child's logic and sat where he was indicated. Mary brought in the turkey from the kitchen, golden and aromatic, followed by a platter of stuffing, another of golden rosemary potatoes, a colorful mayonnaise salad with peas and carrots, and a bowl of homemade orange sauce. "My God, Mary," Edward said, impressed, "this is a feast." "It's my grandmother's recipe," Mary explained as she sat down. "She used to say that Christmas was not about quantity, but about putting love into every seasoning." Lily clasped her hands together and looked expectantly at the adults. "Shall we give thanks?" Edward felt uncomfortable. It had been decades since he had said a prayer before meals. In fact, it had been decades since he had prayed. Period. Mary noticed his hesitation. "Lily, how about you say the blessing today?" The girl closed her eyes solemnly and extended her hands toward the 2 adults. Edward looked at the small hand reaching out to him, and after a moment of hesitation, took it. Lily's soft, warm skin contrasted with his own hand, calloused from constant tension. "Thank you, Heavenly Father, for the most beautiful mommy in the world, for the delicious food, and for sending Edward to be our friend. Amen." "Amen," Edward murmured, surprised by the simplicity and sincerity of the prayer. Mary began to serve, placing generous portions on Edward's plate. "Try the stuffing first. It's the house specialty." The first forkful was an explosion of flavors. The stuffing was crunchy and perfectly seasoned, with bits of bacon, raisins, and Brazil nuts. The turkey was juicy, with crispy skin, and the orange sauce provided a perfect sweet and sour contrast. "This is amazing," Edward said sincerely. "Better than any restaurant I've ever eaten at." "That's because it was made with love," declared Lily, diving into her portion of potatoes. "Mommy always says the secret ingredient is love." "Lily is right," Mary agreed. "I learned to cook from my grandmother, and she always said that food absorbs the feelings of the cook. If you cook with anger, the food turns bitter. If you cook with love, it tastes wonderful." Edward paused, eating, reflecting on her words. "So that's why I never enjoy meals at my house. They're prepared by people who hardly know me, who do it just out of professional obligation." "Exactly. There's no soul in the food, it's just fuel for the body." "But During dinner, the conversation flowed naturally. Lily talked about school, her favorite drawings, her favorite teacher, and her dream of being an astronaut when she grows up. Edward found himself genuinely interested in the girl's stories, asking questions and laughing at her hilariously direct observations about the adult world. "Edward," Lily suddenly asked, "do you have kids?" The silence that followed was heavy. Mary shot a warning glance at her daughter, but Edward raised his hand, indicating that it was okay. "No, Lily, I've never had kids." "Why not? Don't you like children?" "Lily," Mary reprimanded. "It's okay," Edward said gently. "It's a fair question." He turned to Lily. "I do like children, but to have kids you need a family, and I've never had a real family." "Everyone has a family," insisted Lily. "Family isn't just mommy and daddy. It can be grandma, it can be uncle, it can be mommy's friend." Edward smiled sadly. "You're right, but I distanced myself from my family a long time ago." "Why?" Lily's innocent question hit Edward like a punch. How could he explain to an 8-year-old that he had chosen professional success over family relationships? That he had been so obsessed with proving his worth through money that he lost all the people he loved? "Because I made mistakes," he said simply. "And sometimes, when you make too many mistakes, people drift away." "But you can say you're sorry," suggested Lily with the simplicity of someone who still believes that all problems have easy solutions. "It's not always that simple, dear." Mary watched the conversation with a heavy heart. She saw the pain in Edward's eyes and recognized the weight of loneliness he carried. "Lily," she gently intervened, "how about you show Edward the photo album from our last trip to the beach?" "Good idea." Lily ran off to get the album, leaving the two adults alone. "I'm sorry," Mary said. "She still doesn't understand much about personal boundaries. Don't apologize. In fact, it's refreshing to talk to someone who asks direct questions without ulterior motives." Edward took a sip of wine, a simple bottle that Mary had bought at the neighborhood market, but it had an honest flavor that he appreciated more than the expensive wines in his cellar. "Can I ask you a question now?" "Of course." "Why didn't you marry again? A woman like you, smart, caring, beautiful. Surely there are no shortage of suitors." Mary blushed slightly, fiddling with the food on her plate. "I think I'm still learning to trust again. My ex-husband hurt me a lot, not just with the betrayals, but with the way he made me feel inadequate for years." "Inadequate? You?" "He always said I wasn't sophisticated enough to keep up with him socially, that my clothes were too simple, that I didn't know how to talk about the right subjects, that my family was too humble." Mary paused, swallowing her tears. "For years, I believed he was right." Edward felt a rage growing inside him. How could someone make a woman like Mary feel inadequate? "He was completely wrong," Edward said with intensity. "You are the most genuine person I've ever met. Your simplicity is not a flaw, it's a virtue. You are real, Mary. In a world full of fake and selfish people, you are authentic." Mary's eyes filled with tears. "Thank you. That means a lot." Lily came running back with a worn photo album in her hands. "Look, Edward, these are our pictures from the beach." The next 2 hours flew by as Lily showed photos, told stories, and made Edward laugh with her witty observations. Mary brought out dessert, homemade French toast, sprinkled with cinnamon and sugar, accompanied by fresh coffee. "Lily, did you make the French toast?" Edward asked. "I helped. Mommy let me mix the eggs and sprinkle the cinnamon. Was it good?" Edward took a bite and involuntarily closed his eyes. The sweet flavor and soft texture transported him back to his childhood, to Sunday mornings at the farm, when his grandmother made French toast in the old wood-burning kitchen. "It's perfect, Lily. Better than any dessert from a French patisserie." The girl clapped her hands in joy, and Edward realized that seeing that smile was becoming addictive. When dessert was over, Lily began to yawn. Mary looked at the clock. It was almost 10 at night. "Someone needs to go to bed," Mary said. "Tomorrow is Christmas." "Just a little longer, Mommy. Please. No more just a little longer. Go brush your teeth." Lily sighed dramatically, but obeyed. Before leaving the room, she ran to Edward and gave him a tight hug. "Thank you for coming to dinner with us, Edward. It was the best Christmas of my life." Edward returned the hug, feeling an emotion he hadn't experienced in decades. When Lily pulled away, he had to blink several times to hold back tears. "Thank you for letting me be part of your Christmas, Princess." After Lily went to bed, Edward and Mary were alone in the living room, the comfortable silence broken only by the sound of the rain outside and the ticking of the wall clock. "Mary," Edward said softly, "thank you for everything. I hadn't felt human." "Exactly." Mary smiled, bending down to pick up some plates. Edward stopped her, taking her hand. "Leave that for later. Sit with me for a while." She complied, and they sat on the sofa, close but not touching, both processing the emotional intensity of the night. "Edward, can I tell you something?" "Of course. You have a second chance, with your family, with life, with everything. It's never too late to start over." Edward looked at her, seeing the sincerity in her green eyes. "What if I don't know how?" "Then learn. One day at a time." The first days of January brought a subtle but noticeable change in Edward's behavior. Mary noticed during their morning meetings that he took more pauses, looked out the window with a thoughtful expression she hadn't seen before, and for the first time in 3 weeks of working together, he asked about her personal life. "How was Lily's new year?" he asked on a sunny Tuesday morning while they reviewed contracts for the new plant in Minas Gerais. She loved the fireworks on TV, stayed up until midnight for the first time in her life, and made a wish list for 2025 that included "Meet Edward again," Mary replied with a smile. Edward stopped flipping through the documents. "She said that?" "She did, and added that she wanted to take you to the park to show you her favorite ducks at the lake." Before Edward could respond, the office door swung open abruptly. Carlos Montgomery, his partner for 15 years and vice president of Montgomery Steel Corporation, entered unceremoniously, something unusual even for his informal standards. Carlos was a 52-year-old man, short and stocky, with graying hair always slicked back and a posture that exuded authority. He wore a dark grey Armani suit and carried an Italian leather briefcase that cost more than the monthly salary of many employees at the company. "Edward, we need to talk," Carlos said, casting a cold glance at Mary. "Alone. Carlos, you know my assistant, Mary Smith. Mary, this is Carlos Montgomery, my partner." Mary stood up to greet him, but Carlos merely nodded coldly, clearly impatient. "Mary, can you give us a few minutes?" Edward asked. After Mary left, Carlos flopped into the armchair in front of Edward's desk with a worried expression. "Edward, what the hell is going on with you? What are you talking about?" Carlos opened the briefcase and spread a series of documents across the desk. "I'm talking about the latest reports you approved. The industrial park project? You cancelled a $200 million construction because there was a historic bakery on the site." Edward leaned forward. "Ms. Johnson's bakery has been around for 60 years, Carlos. It's a community heritage." "It's a failing business occupying a strategic piece of land," Carlos exclaimed. "And that's not all. You increased the budget for environmental measures in the Ribeirão Preto project by 40%. You raised the salaries of all the contractors without prior consultation. And now I've heard you're planning to create a scholarship program for employees' children. And what's the problem?" Carlos stood up, walking to the window. "The problem, my dear friend, is that we are running a company, not an NGO. Our Japanese investors are already questioning these unnecessary expenses. The board has called an extraordinary meeting for next week." Edward felt a chill ran down his spine. "An extraordinary meeting for what?" "To discuss your leadership capabilities." Carlos turned to face him. "Edward, we've been friends for 15 years. We've built this empire together. But you're changing, and not for the better from a business perspective. I'm changing for the better from a human perspective. And since when does that matter in business?" Carlos returned to the armchair, his voice taking on a softer, almost paternal tone. "Look, I understand you've spent years focused solely on work, isolating yourself from everything and everyone. It's natural that now you feel the need to, how can I put it, humanize." Edward didn't like the condescending tone of his partner. "But," Carlos continued, "you can't let feelings interfere with corporate decisions. I've heard your new assistant has a considerable influence over you." "What do you mean by that?" "I mean that perhaps she's not the most suitable person to work so closely with you, especially if she's causing distractions." Edward slowly stood up, his voice taking on a dangerously low tone. "Be careful with what you're about to say, Carlos. I'm saying you need to choose. Either you go back to being the ruthless businessman who built this empire, or you find a philanthropic hobby that doesn't interfere with business." "And what if I don't want to make that choice?" Carlos sighed. "Then maybe it's time to consider if you're still the right person to lead this company." The silence that followed was tense. Edward looked at the man he considered his closest friend and saw only cold calculation. "I understand," Edward finally said. "You can go. I have work to do." After Carlos left, Edward was alone in his office, feeling the weight of the conversation. He walked to the window and looked out at the city below, people rushing back and forth, each carrying their own burdens and dreams. A soft knock on the door pulled him from his thoughts. Mary entered carrying a cup of coffee and a plate with a sandwich. "I thought you might need a snack," she said, placing the tray on the table. "Thank you." Edward sat down but didn't touch the food. "Mary, can I ask you a personal question?" "Of course." "Do you think I'm being naive with these changes in the company, with this attempt to be more human?" Mary sat in the chair across from the desk, studying his face carefully. "Can I be honest? Please. I think you're scared. You've spent so long building walls that now, when you finally decide to tear them down, you don't know how to handle the vulnerability that comes with it." Edward bit into the sandwich. It was turkey with cream cheese and arugula, simple but tasty. "My partner thinks you're influencing me negatively." Mary was silent for a moment. "And you? What do you think?" "I think you're influencing me positively, and that scares them." "Edward, can I tell you a story?" He nodded. "When Lily was 5 years old, she found an injured bird in the yard. She wanted to take care of it, but I explained that wild birds need to be free to be happy. She cried, but she understood. Do you know what she told me afterward?" "What?" "That sometimes loving someone means letting that person choose their own path, even if it's hard for those who love them." Mary leaned forward. "I'm not trying to change you, Edward. I'm just showing you that there are other ways to see the world." Edward felt a tightness in his chest. What if choosing this more human path means losing everything I've built? Then you'll rebuild something better, something that really matters. The intercom buzzed, interrupting the conversation. Carol's voice echoed through the office. "Mr. Edward, there's a Dr. Helen Montgomery downstairs asking to come up. She says she's your sister." Edward went pale. Helen, his younger sister, whom he hadn't spoken to in 8 years, since their mother's tumultuous funeral. "Mr. Edward," Carol insisted. Edward looked at Mary, who was watching his reaction with concern. "Send her up," he finally said, his voice coming out hoarse. Mary stood to leave, but Edward stopped her. "Stay, please. I think I'm going to need a witness for what's to come." 5 minutes later, Helen Montgomery entered the office. At 38 years old, she was a female version of Edward, tall, elegant, with the same intensity in her brown eyes. She wore a pristine white blazer, black dress pants, and a posture that exuded authority. Her blonde hair was pulled back into a low bun, and she carried a Hermes bag that cost more than a compact car. "Edward," she said simply, stopping in the middle of the room. "Helen." His voice came out colder than he intended. "You haven't changed a bit. Still the same man, holed up in your ivory tower. And you're still the same woman who knows how to judge without knowing the facts." Mary watched the exchange with discomfort. feeling the electric tension between the siblings. Helen noticed Mary's presence. "And who are you?" "Mary Smith, executive assistant to Mr. Edward." Helen studied Mary from head to toe with an analytical gaze. "So you're the famous new assistant. Carlos told me about you." Edward stood up abruptly. "Carlos talked to you about Mary." "Carlos is worried about you, Edward. And frankly, after that conversation, so am I." "What conversation?" Helen sat in the armchair uninvited, crossing her legs elegantly. "The conversation where he told me you're making business decisions based on emotions, that you're spending millions on useless social projects, and that it all started when this assistant entered your life." Mary felt her blood boil, but forced herself to maintain her composure. "Helen," Edward said in a dangerous voice, "be careful with what you're about to say." "I'm going to tell the truth, brother. You're being manipulated. A beautiful woman, a sad story of a single mother, a needy child. It's the perfect plot to hook a lonely, rich man." Edward stepped forward, fists clenched. "Enough. Carlos showed me. The photos, Edward. You having dinner at her house on Christmas Eve. You two at a festival in Central Park. She's playing her cards very well." "What photos?" Edward shouted. Helen opened her bag and pulled out an envelope with photographs. Edward took them with trembling hands. They were pictures of him and Lily on different occasions, leaving the building together, talking in the office, at the festival where they had taken shelter from the rain. "How did you get these photos?" "Charles hired a private investigator. He's worried about the company's reputation." Lily slowly stood up, her voice controlled despite the anger she felt. "Excuse me," she said, heading for the door. "Lily, don't go," Edward pleaded. She paused at the door without turning around. "I think it's best to let you talk as a family." And she left, leaving Edward alone with his sister and the weight of his best friend's betrayal. Lily walked through the halls of Montgomery Steel Corporation, trying to control the tears burning in her eyes. She passed Miss Johnson's desk, who looked at her with concern, and headed straight to the women's restroom on the executive floor. She locked herself in a stall and finally allowed the tears to fall freely. Helen's words echoed in her mind. A beautiful woman, a sad story of a single mother, a needy child. It's the perfect plot to hook a lonely rich man. It was exactly what her ex-husband used to say, that she was calculating, mercenary, that she only knew how to take advantage of others' goodwill. Meanwhile, in Edward's office, the confrontation between the siblings reached its peak. "You're unbelievable, Helen," Edward said, throwing the photos on the table. "You hire a detective to spy on me and still have the audacity to come here and accuse me. I'm trying to protect you." "Protect me from what? From being happy for the first time in years?" Helen stood up, walking to the window. "Edward, you've always been too smart to be naive. This woman appeared out of nowhere, got a job at one of the largest companies in the country, gained your trust in weeks, and now she's influencing million-dollar decisions. Don't you find that suspicious?" "What I find suspicious is my partner and my sister conspiring behind my back." "We're not conspiring, we're worried." Helen turned to face him. "When was the last time you went out with a woman? When was the last time you let someone into your life? You're vulnerable, Edward." "I'm human." "It's the same thing." Edward let himself fall into the chair, running his hands through his hair. "Why can't you accept that I've changed, that maybe this change is for the better?" Helen returned to the armchair, her voice taking on a softer tone. "Because we know you, Edward. You've always been like this. Extreme. When you decided to become a businessman, you became obsessive. Now that you've decided to be a philanthropist, you're being impulsive." "I'm not being a philanthropist. I'm trying to be a decent human being, at the cost of the company we built together." Edward looked at his sister, seeing for the first time in years not just the cold businesswoman, but the girl who used to defend him when they were children. "Helen, do you remember when we were kids on the farm? Do you remember how Dad treated the workers?" I remember he went bankrupt because he was too good to be a businessman. He went bankrupt because the American multinational offered better contracts to the big producers. But the farm workers cried at his funeral. They cried for real, Helen. When I die, who will cry for me? Helen fell silent, touched by the vulnerability in her brother's voice. Edward, answer me. Who will miss me? The shareholders? The board? Charles? I will. Really? Because we haven't exchanged a word in 8 years. Helen lowered her eyes. It wasn't just your fault. A soft knock on the door interrupted the moment. Ms. Johnson entered without waiting for a response, something she only did in emergencies. Mr. Edward, I'm sorry to interrupt, but Lily left the building crying and left this on my desk. Miss Johnson handed him a sealed envelope with Edward's name written in neat handwriting. He opened it with trembling hands and read silently. Helen watched his expression change from concern to despair. What is it? She asked. Edward handed over the letter without saying anything. Edward, after today's conversation, I realized that maybe your family and your partners are right. Not about my supposed bad faith, but about the fact that my presence is causing problems for you. It was never my intention to complicate your life or harm your business. I accepted this job because I needed it, but I developed a genuine affection for you as a person. This apparently was a mistake. I don't want you to have to choose between your family, your business, and our friendship. That's why I'm resigning. I've already organized all the projects and updated the files. Thank you for allowing me to know the extraordinary man behind the businessman. Lily will always remember the friend of Mommy who made our Christmas more special. Be happy, Edward. You deserve it. Lily. Helen finished reading and looked at her brother, who was pale as a sheet. Edward, get out, he said quietly. What? Get out! Edward exploded. Get out of my office, get out of my company, and don't ever come back. Edward, you're being irrational. Irrational! He stood up violently, knocking papers off the table. You destroyed the only good thing that happened in my life in the last 10 years, and I'm the one being irrational. Helen stood up too, grabbing her bag. You will regret this. Regret what? Defending a person who showed me what it is to be human again, choosing happiness over money, choosing a stranger over your family. Edward laughed bitterly. What family, Helen? A family that hasn't spoken to me in 8 years, that only shows up when they want to control me, that hires investigators to spy on me. Lily is more family to me than you ever were. Helen paused at the door, turning one last time. When this illusion ends, when you discover who she really is, don't come looking for me. Don't worry, I won't. After Lily left, Edward was alone in his office, staring at the resignation letter. He grabbed his phone and called Lily, but it went straight to voicemail. He tried 3 more times with the same result. Desperate, he grabbed his car keys and rushed out of the office, ignoring the greetings from employees and the calls that Carol was trying to transfer. The traffic in New York had never seemed so slow. Edward honked impatiently, switched lanes constantly, and cursed other drivers, behavior completely atypical for him. He arrived at Maple Street in 25 minutes, a personal record. The yellow house with the green gate was silent. Edward rang the doorbell several times, but no one answered. Finally, an elderly lady came out of the house next door. If you're looking for Lily and her sister, they left with luggage an hour ago, the neighbor informed. Edward's heart stopped. With luggage? Yes, sir. Lily was crying a lot, poor thing. They said they were going to spend a few days at her sister's house in Santa Monica. Edward thanked her and returned to his car, feeling completely lost. Lily had run away because of him, because of the problems his presence in her life had caused. Back at the office, Edward found Charles waiting in his office. I heard Lily was here, Charles said, sitting in the armchair, as if he owned the place. And I heard you hired a private investigator to spy on me. Charles showed no surprise at being discovered. It was necessary. Necessary for what? To protect the company. Edward, you've completely lost your sense of reality. You're making emotional decisions that could cost millions. Edward sat behind the desk, studying the man he considered his best friend. Charles, how many years have we worked together? 15. 15 years building this company. You know my story, you know my family, you know why I distanced myself from everyone? I know. Then how can you think I would be naive enough to be manipulated by a woman I barely know? Charles leaned forward. Because lonely men make stupid choices when a beautiful woman gives them attention. Lily is not a beautiful woman. She's an extraordinary person who reminded me that there's life beyond this company. And you're willing to throw everything away for that. Extraordinary person. Edward was silent for a long moment, reflecting on the question. Finally, he looked directly into Charles's eyes. If necessary, yes. Charles sighed and stood up. Then I think our partnership has come to an end. What do you mean? The board met this morning in an extraordinary session. Unanimously, we decided that you need to choose. Either you return to being the businessman you always were, or we take over the operational control of the company. Edward felt as if he had been punched in the stomach. You can't do that. We can and we will. You are still the president and majority shareholder, but you've lost the authority to make unilateral decisions. Charles headed for the door. You have 48 hours to decide. Alone again, Edward looked out the window at the city stretching to the horizon. For 15 years, he had built his steel empire brick by brick, sacrificing relationships and personal happiness for professional success. Now, when he had finally found a reason to live beyond work, he was losing everything at once. He picked up the handcrafted keychain that Lily had made for him and always carried in his pocket. Best Mom's Boss, read the small metal plaque. An 8-year-old had seen in him qualities that his decades-long partners could not perceive. Edward made his decision. Edward didn't sleep that night. He stayed awake in his empty penthouse, pacing back and forth, with Lily's keychain in hand and the letter from Lily on the coffee table. At 5 in the morning, he made a decision that would change the course of his life forever. He put on a pair of jeans, a piece he hadn't worn in years, a navy polo shirt and casual sneakers. He grabbed the keys to the Mercedes, but stopped in the garage. That car represented everything he was trying to leave behind. Instead, he called an Uber. "Santa Monica, please," he said to the driver, a middle-aged man who greeted him cheerfully. During the 2-hour ride, Edward watched the landscape change from urban concrete to the greenery of the Santa Monica Mountains. The driver, Mr. Johnson, was talkative and shared stories about his family, his grandchildren, his financial struggles, and his simple dreams. Edward found himself genuinely interested in the life of this man who, with much less, seemed infinitely happier than he was. "Are you visiting family?" Mr. Johnson asked. "I'll try," Edward replied, unsure if he would be able to find Lily. Arriving in Santa Monica, Edward realized he had no idea where Lily might be. The city had over 400,000 inhabitants, and he didn't even know her sister's full name. His only clue was that Lily had mentioned her sister lived near the beach. He started at the waterfront, walking along the avenues close to the beach, entering bakeries, pharmacies, and small shops, showing a photo of Lily from his phone and asking if anyone recognized her. After 3 hours of fruitless searching, he sat on a beach wall to rest. It was then that he heard a familiar voice. "Edward!" He turned and saw Lily running toward him, her curly hair flying in the sea breeze. She was wearing a yellow dress with a shell print and running barefoot on the sand. "Lily!" Edward stood up, opening his arms to embrace the girl. "I knew you would find us," she said, hugging him tightly. "I told Mom you would come." "Where's your mom?" "Over there at the smoothie bowl stand with Aunt Julia. She's very sad, Edward. She cried all night." Edward felt his heart tighten. Lily took him by the hand and dragged him toward a colorful stand where Lily... She was sitting at a white plastic table, talking to a woman who was clearly her younger sister. Julia was a younger version of Lily, 28 years old, with lighter hair, an easy smile, but the same expressive green eyes. She wore a turquoise swimsuit under a sheer cover-up and had the tanned skin of someone who lived by the coast. Lily had her back to Edward, wearing a white cotton dress, her hair blowing in the wind. When she heard Sophia shout, "Look who I found!" she turned slowly. The shock in her eyes was evident. She was pale, showing signs of having cried a lot, yet still beautiful in Edward's eyes. "Edward," her voice came out as a whisper, "what are you doing here?" "I came to get you." Lily stood up slowly, her expression a mix of surprise, relief, and fear. "How did you find me?" "It wasn't easy. I searched the whole city for you." Julia watched the scene with curiosity. "So this is the famous Edward," she said, standing up to greet him. "Julia, Lily's sister. I've heard a lot about you." "I hope not everything was bad," Edward replied, not taking his eyes off Lily. "Actually, it was all very good. Lily hasn't stopped talking about you for weeks." "Julia," Lily scolded, blushing. Edward smiled. "Can we talk alone?" Lily hesitated, but Julia intervened. "Sophia, how about we go get ice cream and let the adults talk?" "But I want to stay with Edward," Sophia protested. "Sophia," Lily said gently, "go with Aunt Julia. Edward and I need to talk." And after Julia and Sophia walked away, Edward and Lily were left alone in the booth. She sat down again, nervously fiddling with a paper napkin. "Lily, why did you run away?" "I didn't run away. I came to visit my sister." "With luggage? The day after a resignation letter?" Lily sighed. "Edward, your family is right. I'm complicating your life. My family knows nothing about my life. They haven't for 8 years. But they know about business. And apparently my presence is hurting your business." Edward sat in the chair next to her. "Lily, look at me." She reluctantly obeyed. "My business can go to hell. You are more important." "Don't say that. It's the truth. I spent 15 years building an empire of steel and concrete, but in 3 weeks you showed me what really matters in life." Lily's eyes filled with tears. "Edward, you don't understand. Your sister showed me the photos. You are being investigated because of me. This could destroy your reputation. And so what?" "What do you mean, and so what? You are one of the most respected businessmen in the country." Edward took her hands in his. "Lily, listen to me. I would rather be an ordinary man loved by you and Sophia than be the most powerful businessman in the world and remain alone." "You don't know what you're saying." "I know exactly what I'm saying. Yesterday, after you left, Charles and the board gave me an ultimatum. Either I go back to being the ruthless businessman I was before, or I lose operational control of the company." Lily turned pale. "Edward, no. I've made my decision. I'm going to hand over operational control to them. I'll keep my shares, I'll remain chairman of the board, but I won't kill myself working 60 hours a week anymore." "Are you crazy? You're going to throw everything away for me?" "Not for you, for us. For you, me, and Sophia." Lily abruptly stood up, walking to the edge of the booth. The sea stretched infinitely before her, and Edward watched her struggle with her own demons. "Lily, tell me what is really scaring you." She was silent for a long moment before responding. "My ex-husband told me I was materialistic, that I only knew how to take advantage of people. For years I believed him." Her voice began to falter. "And now, when I finally find someone who makes me feel valuable, who makes me believe I can be loved for who I am, your family says exactly the same thing." Edward stood up and walked to her, placing his hands on her shoulders. "Your ex-husband was an idiot, and my family, well, my family has its own problems." He made her turn to face him. "But I know you, Lily. I know your heart, your kindness, your integrity. And I know you love me for the man I am, not for the money I have." "How can you be so sure?" Because you made me want to be a better man, because you introduced me to your daughter, shared your table, opened your home, because when you offered me your friendship, you knew nothing about my fortune." Lily cried silently, and Edward pulled her into a hug. "Lily, I love you." She pulled back to look him in the eyes. "What?" "I love you. I love your simplicity, your honesty, your way of caring for everyone. I love how you talk about Sophia, how you make French toast, how you question my decisions in the office. I love how you make me feel human. Edward, I love you, and I love Sophia as if she were my own daughter. You two gave me a family I didn't even know I wanted." Lily then kissed him. A kiss, salty with tears, sweet with hope, intense with the passion they had been holding back for weeks. When they separated, she whispered, "I love you too. Then come back to New York with me. Let's face this together. What if it goes wrong? What if your family is right? Then we'll find out together, but I'm not going to give up on us without a fight." Lily looked at the sea, then at Edward, and finally smiled, the first genuine smile he had seen since he arrived. "Okay, let's go home." At that moment, Sophia came running with ice cream smeared on her face. "Edward, Aunt Julia said you came to get us. Does that mean you're going to be my stepdad?" Edward laughed, picking the girl up in his arms. "If you're Mum, can I? Please, please, please." Lily looked at Edward holding his daughter, both smiling at her with anticipation, and felt her heart fill with a happiness she hadn't experienced in years. "I think we can negotiate," she said, laughing. But as they prepared to return to New York, none of them imagined that the real battle was just beginning. The return to New York was not triumphant as Edward had envisioned. The following Monday, he arrived at the office determined to implement his decisions, but found a scene that completely caught him off guard. Charles was sitting in his presidential chair behind his desk, reviewing documents as if he were the owner of the company. Edward stopped at the door, observing the surreal scene. "Charles, what are you doing in my chair?" Charles looked up without showing surprise. "Edward, good morning. Please, have a seat." "In my own office?" "In the office of the interim president of Montgomery Steel Corporation." Charles stood up, extending an official document. "The board met in an emergency session yesterday. Considering your unjustified absence on Friday and over the weekend, and based on Clause 15 of the Articles of Incorporation, I am temporarily assuming the executive presidency." Edward took the document with trembling hands. It was all legal, technically correct, and his signature was there at the bottom, a clause he had insisted on including years ago as protection against possible health issues or temporary incapacity. "You used my own legal protection against me. We used the necessary tools to protect the company." Charles returned to the chair. "Edward, you are still the largest shareholder and chairman of the board, but operational decisions now go through me." At that moment, Lily entered the room, carrying 2 cups of coffee, stopping abruptly at the sight. "Sorry, I didn't know there was a meeting." "Ms. Smith," Charles said with a cold smile, "it's good to see you back. By the way, I need to speak with you as well." Edward felt a chill in his stomach. "Charles, as the new executive president, I am implementing some changes in the administrative structure. The position of personal executive assistant is being eliminated. Starting today, administrative support will be provided by the secretary pool." Lily paled. "Mr. Montgomery, does that mean—" "It means your services are no longer required. HR has prepared your termination. You can collect your belongings today." Edward exploded. "You can't do this." "I can, and I did. It's a purely administrative decision aimed at optimizing resources." Charles looked directly at Lily. "Of course, if you wish to stay with the company, we have a receptionist position available on the ground floor. The salary is much lower, but—" "Enough!" Edward slammed his fist on the table. "Lily, don't accept this. Let's get out of here." "Edward," Lily gently touched his arm. "It's okay. I accept the termination." "Lily, no. I need to sort out some personal matters anyway." She looked into his eyes with an intensity that made him understand there was something more behind her decision. "Mr. Montgomery, can you give me a few minutes to gather my things?" "Of course, you can use the rest of the morning." After Lily left, Charles and Edward were alone. The silence was heavy, laden with 15 years of friendship unraveling at that moment. "Why are you doing this, Charles?" "Because I've known you for 15 years, Edward. I know you are brilliant in business but naive in personal relationships. This woman is destroying you. She is saving me. She is blinding you. And I'm not the only one who thinks so." Charles opened a drawer and pulled out a folder with documents. "I had your protégé's past investigated more deeply." Edward felt his stomach tighten. "What investigation?" "Lily Smith is not as innocent as she seems." Charles opened the folder. "Her ex-husband did not die in a car accident while returning from his mistress's house." "How?" "Robert Allen did die in an accident, yes, but he was fleeing from the police after being caught embezzling money from the company where he worked, a construction company that, interestingly, had contracts with our corporation." Edward went cold. "That's a lie. It's all here. Police reports, newspaper articles, court documents." Charles extended the papers. "Lily knew about her husband's schemes. There is evidence that she helped him launder money through shell accounts. I don't believe a word of it. And there's more. The custody of her daughter is being contested not only by her ex-mother-in-law, but also by the Department of Justice. There are suspicions that she is using the child to scam wealthy and lonely men." Edward stood up violently. "You're lying." "Edward, she sought you out. She got a job at one of the largest companies in the country without having the proper experience for the position. She gained your trust in weeks and started influencing million-dollar decisions. Don't you think that's too much of a coincidence? I think you're desperate to separate me from anything that could make me happy." Charles sighed. "Edward, we've been friends for 15 years. We were. Now we are just business partners." Edward stormed out of the room, slamming the door, and went to find Lily. He found her in the small adjoining office, packing her few personal belongings into a cardboard box. She wasn't crying, but her expression was one of deep sadness. "Lily, I don't believe anything Charles said." She stopped what she was doing and looked at him. "What did he say?" Edward hesitated. Charles's accusations were too serious to be repeated carelessly. He said he investigated your past, that your husband didn't die the way you told me." Lily went very pale and slowly sat down in the chair. "Edward, I need to tell you some things I didn't share before." His heart stopped. "Lily, my ex-husband really did die in a car accident, but he was fleeing from the police, not returning from his mistress's house." Her voice was low, controlled. "Robert was being investigated for embezzling funds from the company where he worked." Edward sat down too, feeling the world spin around him. "And you knew?" "Not completely. I knew something was wrong. Robert started coming home with expensive gifts. He talked to move to a bigger house, to travel. But when I asked where the extra money was coming from, he said it was bonuses from work." "Marina, 3 days before the accident, the police showed up at our house with a search warrant. That's when I discovered everything. Robert had embezzled almost $2 million over 3 years. Edward ran his hands through his hair. "Why didn't you tell me this before?" "Because I was afraid of how you would react. Because even though I'm innocent, I knew it would look like I was guilty." Marina started to cry. "And because I knew that if you found out, you would never trust me again." "Is there anything else I should know?" Marina took a deep breath. "My mother-in-law is really trying to take custody of Lily from me. Not just for stability reasons, but because she believes I was involved in Robert's crimes." Edward fell silent, processing all the information. "Edward, I understand if you want me to disappear from your life. I understand if you think Charles and his family were right." He looked at her for a long moment. Marina was there, vulnerable, waiting for his judgment. All of Charles's accusations echoed in his mind, but when he looked at her, he saw only the woman who had cared for him at Christmas dinner, who had brought him morning coffee at his home, who had changed his life for the better. "Marina, do you love me?" "With all my heart." "And do you love Lily?" "She is my life." "Then that's what matters." Edward stood up and pulled her into an embrace. "I don't care what your ex-husband did. I don't care what people think. I love you and I trust you." Marina cried with relief in his arms. "But," Edward said, pulling away to look her in the eyes, "we need to resolve this custody issue, and we need to prove your innocence once and for all." "How?" "By hiring the best lawyers in the country, by investigating everything again, and by fighting." Marina smiled through her tears. "Are you sure? This could cost a lot of money and—" "Marina, I would lose everything I have if necessary to protect you and Lily." At that moment, Marina's phone rang. She looked at the screen and turned pale. "It's Lily's school. She never calls at this hour." Marina answered with trembling hands. Edward watched her expression change from worry to panic. "What? What do you mean she's not at school? What do you mean a woman came to pick her up with a court order?" Edward felt his blood run cold. "Lily was taken by my mother-in-law," Marina said in a desperate voice. "She got an emergency injunction, claiming that I am a danger to the child." Edward grabbed the car keys. "Let's go get her." "Edward, it's a court order. If we try to take Lily by force, then we'll resolve this legally, but we will resolve it today." They rushed out of the building, unaware that Charles was watching from the office window with a satisfied expression. His plan was working perfectly. The law firm Moreira and Associates occupied 2 entire floors of a mirrored building on Faria Lima Avenue. Edward had hired Dr. Robert Moreira, considered the best family lawyer in New York, but still felt powerless in the situation. Marina was sitting in the brown leather armchair, trembling not from cold, but from despair. It had been 12 hours since she had seen Lily, and every passing minute was torture. Dr. Beatrice Smith obtained the injunction based on 3 main arguments, explained Dr. Moreira, a 60-year-old man with grey hair and an impeccable reputation. "First, she claimed that you are involved in your ex-husband's crimes. Second, that you are in a state of emotional and financial instability. And third," he hesitated, looking uncomfortably at Edward. "Third what?" Edward pressed. "That you are getting involved with wealthy men for personal gain, putting the child in inappropriate situations." Marina closed her eyes, feeling humiliated. "She's talking about you, Edward." "I understand." "Dr. Moreira, how much time do we have to reverse this? The hearing is scheduled for tomorrow at 2 p.m. It's short notice, but we have some chances. I need you both to tell me everything, absolutely everything about your relationships, finances, and professional history. Any detail could be important." For the next 3 hours, Marina and Edward shared their stories in detail. Dr. Moreira took meticulous notes, occasionally interrupting to ask more specific questions. "Marina," the lawyer finally said, "do you have any proof that you were not involved in your ex-husband's crimes?" "I have bank statements from the last 5 years. There have never been any suspicious deposits. And I have emails where I questioned Robert about his trips and excessive spending." "Excellent. Edward, when did your relationship with Marina begin exactly?" "She was hired as my assistant in December. Our first social meeting was Christmas dinner at her house." "And the hiring, how did that happen?" Edward frowned. "Actually, I wasn't directly involved in the hiring process. Charles handled everything." Dr. Moreira and Marina looked at him simultaneously. "What do you mean?" Marina asked. "Charles said he had found the perfect candidate for the position. He presented her resume, her references, and I approved the hiring without a personal interview." A heavy silence settled in the room. Dr. Moreira was the first to speak. "Edward, didn't that seem strange to you at the time? Charles always handled administrative hires. I trusted his judgment." Marina turned pale. "Edward, what if Charles hired me knowing my situation. What if this was planned from the beginning? Planned for what? Dr. Moreira leaned forward. To create exactly the situation we are in now. A wealthy, lonely man getting involved with a problematic woman, causing instability in his business and reputation. Edward stood up abruptly. That's impossible. Charles has been my friend for 15 years. Edward, Marina said softly, he had access to my personal information during the hiring process. He knew about my financial situation, about Lily's custody, about the problems with my ex-husband. You're being paranoid. We're being realistic, Dr. Johnson retorted. Edward, I need you to investigate how Lily was selected for the position. Who recommended her? What criteria were used? What references were checked? Edward's phone rang. It was Carol, the receptionist. Mr. Edward, sorry to bother you, but there's a situation here at the office. What situation? Some Japanese executives have arrived for the 4 p.m. meeting, but Mr. Charles said they are no longer welcome at the company. The Japanese are confused and demanding to speak with you. Edward glanced at his watch. He had completely forgotten about the meeting with the investors from Yamamoto Industries. Tell them I'll be there in 20 minutes. After hanging up, Edward turned to Dr. Johnson. I need to resolve a problem at the company. Can you continue working on Lily's case? Of course, but Edward, be very careful. If our suspicion about Charles is correct, he may be planning something more. Edward arrived at the office to find the lobby in an uproar. 5 impeccably dressed Japanese executives were conversing animatedly with Carol, who was trying to explain the situation in her limited English. Mr. Yamamoto, Edward approached the delegation leader, greeting him with a slight bow. I apologize for the confusion. Mr. Montgomery, Yamamoto replied in perfect English, we are very confused. Your partner told us that the contracts were cancelled due to administrative instabilities in your company. Edward felt his anger boil. The contracts with Yamamoto Industries were worth $800 million and represented the company's largest international partnership. There has been a misunderstanding, Mr. Yamamoto. The contracts remain valid, and our company is perfectly stable. But your partner said, my partner does not have the authority to cancel contracts of this magnitude. Edward deliberately lied, knowing that technically Charles had that authority as acting president. Please, follow me to the conference room. For the next hour, Edward managed to reassure the Japanese executives and reaffirm the company's commitments. But when the delegation left, Charles appeared in the hallway with a furious expression. Edward, you didn't have the authority to make those promises, and you didn't have the authority to cancel the contracts. I did. As acting president, I can make any decision I deem necessary to protect the company. Edward studied the face of the man he had considered his best friend for 15 years. For the first time, he saw something he had never noticed before, a calculating coldness that went beyond business pragmatism. Charles, why did you hire Lily? The question caught Charles off guard. For a fraction of a second, Edward saw a look of panic in his eyes. What do you mean? You personally handled her hiring. Why? You've never done that before. Because I thought she would be suitable for the position. Based on what? What criteria? Charles hesitated for too long before responding. Resume. References. Experience. What references, Charles? Lily told me that the last company she worked for closed 2 years ago. Who did you talk to? Charles's silence was revealing. Edward, you're being paranoid. Maybe you should focus on solving your personal problems instead of creating imaginary conspiracies. Personal problems that conveniently arose after Lily was hired. Charles laughed, but the laugh sounded forced. Edward, you're seeing connections where there are none. Am I? Then explain to me how Lily's ex-mother-in-law managed to get an emergency injunction based on information that only someone inside the company could have provided. Charles paled. I don't know what you're talking about. I know you do, and I will uncover the whole truth. Edward headed for the exit, but Charles grabbed him by the arm. "Edward, you're making a mistake. This woman will destroy everything we've built. The only person destroying anything here is you." Edward shook free and left the building, leaving Charles alone in the hallway. He didn't see when Charles grabbed his phone and made a call. "Dr. Beatrice, it's Charles Montgomery. We need to expedite the process. Edward is starting to suspect." On the other end of the line, the woman's voice was cold and calculating. "Don't worry. Tomorrow at the hearing, Lily Smith will lose custody for good, and after that, she will disappear from Edward's life forever. And if he doesn't give up, then we will use Plan B, the false evidence we prepared about her involvement in the money laundering scheme." Charles hung up with a grim smile. 15 years ago, when he met Edward, he saw in him not just a business partner, but a golden opportunity. Edward had the brilliance and vision to build an empire, but Charles always knew that one day he would need to take full control. Lily had been the perfect opportunity, a vulnerable woman with a complicated past, who could be easily manipulated to emotionally and professionally destroy Edward. What Charles had not calculated was that Edward would actually fall in love with her, nor that Lily would be genuinely honest and caring. Now, the plan was spiraling out of control, and he would need more drastic measures. At his ex-mother-in-law's house in Beverly Hills, Lily cried silently in a luxurious but cold room. The 8-year-old girl did not understand why she had been separated from her mother, nor why the grandmother she barely knew spoke of her as if she were a bad person. "Mommy," she whispered to the teddy bear she always took everywhere, "please come get me." On the other side of the city, Lily and Edward were desperately working with Dr. Johnson, gathering evidence and preparing the defense for the hearing the next day. Neither of them imagined that the battle for their family's future was just beginning. The morning of the hearing dawned cloudy, with a light drizzle that made New York even grayer. Lily had not slept. She spent the night sitting by her bedroom window, looking out at the empty street and wondering where her daughter was, if she was scared, if she understood what was happening. Edward arrived at her house at 8 a.m., finding her dressed in a simple but elegant navy blue suit they had bought the day before. He was wearing his best Italian suit. If they were going to fight, Lily fought with dignity. "How are you feeling?" he asked, embracing her. "Like a mother who might lose her daughter today," Lily replied, her voice steady but heavy with emotion. On the way to the family court, they reviewed their strategy once again with Dr. Johnson. The lawyer had worked all night and managed to gather important evidence. "I secured 2 significant victories," Dr. Johnson said in the car. "First, I proved that Lily never had access to the accounts where her ex-husband deposited the embezzled money. Second, I obtained a recording of a call where Robert confesses to an accomplice that he kept Lily in the dark about everything." Lily breathed a sigh of relief. "Is that enough?" "It's a start. But the most important part will be your testimonies. Lily, be honest, straightforward, and emotional. Show the judge that you are a devoted mother. Edward, demonstrate that your intentions are genuine and that you can provide stability for the family." The court was bustling, with lawyers rushing back and forth and families waiting for their hearings. When they entered the room, Lily saw Sophia for the first time in 2 days. The girl was sitting next to Dr. Beatrice Smith, a 55-year-old elegant and imposing woman with grey hair tied in a tight bun. Sophia wore a pink dress that Lily had never seen, clearly bought by her grandmother, and looked small and lost in the large chair. "Mommy!" Sophia tried to stand up, but Dr. Beatrice held her firmly. "Sophia, remember what we talked about. You need to stay quiet here next to me." Lily's heart broke at the sight of fear in her daughter's eyes. Edward noticed her trembling hands and discreetly held them. The judge, Ms. Carmen Lucia Ferreira, a 50-year-old woman with a reputation for justice and impartiality, entered the room, and everyone stood up. "You may sit. This is a temporary custody hearing in the case of Smith versus Smith. Dr. Beatrice represents the petitioner and Dr. Johnson represents the respondent. Dr. Beatrice's attorney, a young and aggressive woman named Ms. Amanda Collins, began her argument. Your Honor, the petitioner seeks custody of her granddaughter Sophia because the child's mother does not provide adequate conditions for safety and stability. Lily Smith was married to a criminal, was aware of his illegal activities, and has now become involved with a wealthy man in a clear attempt to benefit financially. Edward felt his anger boiling, but Dr. Johnson prevented him from speaking out. Furthermore, Ms. Amanda continued, Lily has recently lost her job and is unable to support the child adequately. Dr. Johnson stood up. Your Honor, I would like to contest all these allegations with concrete evidence. For the next hour, Dr. Johnson systematically presented evidence of Lily's innocence. Bank statements, emails questioning her ex-husband's spending, the recording where Robert confessed to keeping Lily in the dark, witnesses attesting to her character. As for the relationship with Mr. Edward Montgomery, Dr. Johnson said, it is a genuine love between two adult individuals. Mr. Edward not only offers financial stability, but also paternal love for Sophia. Objection, shouted Ms. Amanda. There is no evidence that the relationship is genuine. It could be purely financial interest. Your Honor, Dr. Johnson said calmly, I would like to call a witness who can clarify the nature of the relationship. The door opened and Carmen, the receptionist, nervously entered. Edward was surprised. He didn't know she had been called as a witness. Ms. Carmen, Dr. Johnson said, how long have you worked for Mr. Edward's company? 15 years, sir. And do you know Mr. Edward well? Very well. He's a good, hard-working man, but he has always been very lonely. Have you noticed any changes in him since Lily started working at the company? Carmen smiled. Oh, yes. He started smiling more, asking about our families, being more affectionate with everyone. And when little Sophia came to visit the office, it was the most beautiful thing to see. He played with her, showed her the view from the window, gave her paper and crayons to draw. Edward looked at Sophia, who was watching him with bright eyes. And do you believe that the relationship between them is genuine? Sir, I have worked for 15 years seeing powerful men with gold diggers. I can recognize when it's a sham. What Lily and Edward have is true love. Ms. Amanda tried to discredit the testimony, but the damage was done. The judge was clearly impressed by Carmen's sincerity. I would like to call Lily Smith to testify, Dr. Johnson said. Lily stood up, her legs trembling. For 20 minutes she told her story, the difficult marriage, her ex-husband's betrayals, her dedication to Sophia, how she met Edward, and how they fell in love. Ms. Lily, Ms. Amanda asked during cross-examination, don't you find it a bit too convenient to get a job at one of the largest companies in the country just when you needed money? I didn't get the job. I was called for an interview and... Lily paused, a look of shock crossing her face. Ms. Lily? I never applied for the job. A murmur ran through the room. Dr. Johnson looked worried. What do you mean, ma'am? I received a call saying my resume had been selected for an executive assistant position, but I never sent my resume to Montgomery Steel Corporation. Edward stood up. Your Honor, may I testify about this? You may, sir. Edward approached the stand with a grim expression. Your Honor, I was not involved in Lily's hiring. My partner, Charles Montgomery, handled the entire process and only presented me with the final result. And did that seem normal to you? At the time, yes, but now I realize there may have been manipulation. Ms. Amanda stood up. Objection! Those are just speculations. They are not speculations, a voice came from the door. Everyone turned to see Charles Montgomery entering the room, accompanied by 2 federal agents. Charles? Edward was confused. What are you doing here? Charles walked to the center of the room with a grim expression. I came to confess. The silence. In the courtroom, it was absolute. Your Honor, said Charles, I orchestrated this entire situation. I hired Lily knowing her vulnerability. I planned to bring her closer to Edward, to destabilize him, emotionally and professionally. Edward turned pale. Why, Charles, why? Because I wanted total control of the company. Because I was tired of always being second. Because I knew that if I could bring you down emotionally, I could take over for good. Lily began to cry, not out of sadness, but relief that her innocence was finally proven. I paid Dr. Beatrice to file for custody, Charles continued. I provided information about Lily, organized the false evidence. Dr. Beatrice turned pale. That's not true. It is, said one of the federal agents, presenting a recorder. We have recordings of all the conversations between Mr. Montgomery and her. The judge banged her gavel. This hearing is suspended. Mr. Montgomery and Dr. Beatrice, you are under arrest for conspiracy, falsification of evidence, and attempted kidnapping. As Charles was led away in handcuffs, he looked at Edward one last time. Edward, I'm sorry, but you never understood that in business there's no room for feelings. You're wrong, Charles. Without feelings, there's no life worth living. 2 hours later, outside the courthouse, Lily was chasing after Sophia in the small playground in front of the building. The girl had returned to being the cheerful and talkative child she always was, as if the last 2 days had just been a bad nightmare. "Mommy! Edward, look how high I can swing!" Edward watched the two, his heart overflowing with happiness. He had lost a friend and a partner, but he had gained a family. "Lily," he said, taking her hand, "I have an important question to ask." "Ooh." "What?" Edward knelt before her, pulling a small blue velvet box from his pocket. "Lily Montgomery, will you marry me? Will you let me be officially Lily's father? Will you build a family with me?" Lily began to cry, but this time it was tears of pure joy. "Yes, 1,000 times yes!" Sophia stopped swinging and ran to them. "Is Edward going to be my real daddy?" "If you want him to be," said Edward, opening his arms to her. "I do. I really do." The three embraced there in the playground, surrounded by the sounds of children playing and the buzz of the city. It was a simple ending to a complicated story, but sometimes the best things in life are the simplest. A year later, on Christmas Eve 2025, Edward's penthouse was unrecognizable. The solitary table had been replaced by a large one, surrounded by loved ones. Lily, now Lily Montgomery, was setting the last dishes, while Sophia, now 9 years old, helped arrange the napkins. Miss Johnson was there with the whole family, Dr. Johnson and his wife Julia, who had moved to New York, and several people from the community that Edward had visited months before. The table was filled with traditional American dishes: turkey, stuffing, French toast, homemade cake. "Edward," said Lily, hugging him from behind as he contemplated the table, "do you remember what you told me on the first Christmas we spent together?" "What?" "That you had never felt so human." Edward smiled, covering her hands with his. "And now I feel complete." Sophia ran to them. "Daddy, Mommy, let's eat. I'm hungry." Edward looked at the girl who now called him Daddy and felt his heart fill with gratitude. He had learned that the true value of Christmas and life is not measured in money or power, but in love, family, and genuine human connections. The Montgomery Steel Corporation continued to be one of the largest companies in the country, but now operated with genuine social policies, environmental responsibility programs, and a president who knew how to balance professional success with personal happiness. And on the wall of Edward's office, next to diplomas and certificates, was a drawing made by Sophia, a family of 3 holding hands, with the word love written in colorful letters underneath. Because sometimes love really can change everything.